Imagine this moment, evening, dark streets, and a car driving slowly along an empty road. Suddenly, bright lights pierce the darkness. It's a police car. An officer steps out onto the road. As full of cruelty and prejudice, he pulls the car to the curb. His steps firm and sure, but there is a hidden danger in his eyes. He sees the black man in front of him, and without the slightest hesitation, violently twists him, driving him to his car. But what if this moment changes forever? The tension in there is unbearable. We're all waiting for the very turn when the officer realizes who is sitting in the car, and when he learns the name of the man's friend, his confidence begins to melt and confusion appears on his face. Now we're curious, what's your name? Where are you watching this video from? Please write in the comments. Each of you is very important to us. Your support helps us grow, develop the channel, and share such incredible stories. We couldn't do it without you, and your input really does make a difference. Leave a comment and let us know you're here with us. You are incredible and we appreciate you. Enjoy the show. Evening came like a soft curtain descending on the city. The dark streets, empty and silent, reflected everything that was hidden from the eyes of daylight. It was rare to see anyone in these neighborhoods after sunset, except for the most determined or those who did not fear the silence of the night. The streets were nearly empty, with only the occasional dim lights of street lamps flickering on, faintly illuminating the shabby sidewalks and sometimes revealing the darkness of corners. These nighttime rides did not frighten John Campbell. He is Saturday behind the wheel of an old, battered car, sliding quietly down the empty road. John was an ordinary black man, almost invisible in the darkness of the night. He was returning home after a long day's work, thinking about how hard it is sometimes to remain calm and dignified in a world where his every move can be judged or misinterpreted. In the car with him Saturday, his best friend, Kevin Harris, a man with whom John had been through fire and water and who had become almost a brother to him. Kevin spoke quietly to him, but there was something tense in his voice, even in this silent night. Suddenly, their solitary movement along the empty road was interrupted by a bright flash. First one and then two bright lights cut through the darkness, approaching from behind. It was a patrol car. John's heart frowned for a moment and his body tensed involuntarily. He didn't know what had caused this fear, but his intuition told him something was wrong. He began to slow down, bringing the car to the curb. Kevin noticed his wariness at once and felt something threatening in the air. "Is everything okay?" Kevin asked, his voice low, but a shadow of concern slipping into it. John nodded quickly, trying not to show alarm. "Yeah, it's fine. It's just, I don't like being stopped." He spoke calmly, but inwardly tense, watching every movement of the car, which was now slowing down and pulling over to the side of the road. The officers in the patrol car turned on his blinkers, and the harsh light flooded the area, making their car stand out clearly against the dark night. "Shit," Kevin whispered, but more to himself. They both knew that a stop like this could always turn into something dangerous. But tonight, on this night, their premonition was especially strong. John pulled himself together, trying not to panic, but anxiety was growing in his chest. He already knew that for people like him, nighttime police stops weren't just a formality. It's always a chance to encounter bias and violence. The patrol car slowed down and soon came to a stop behind their car. There was silence for a moment. John felt his heartbeat grow louder, and the air around them seemed to freeze. The darkness of the night was like a living thing consuming everything around them. John and Kevin Saturday in the car, and all they could hear was the thumping of their hearts filling the void. Suddenly, out of the darkness itself, a bright light burst through, blinding, searing, like spotlights on a stage. John frowned, as if the light were not just a light, but some ominous sign that was tearing at his soul. The light flashed, tearing the air, enveloping their car like a loud, relentless threat. It gave no shade of peace, making their senses sharpen to the breaking point. At that moment, John felt goosebumps run down his skin and a wild tension surge in his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the patrol car, slow and purposeful, coming toward them. Its every step was heavy and predictable, as if the police car wasn't just a vehicle, but the very essence of the threat. The huge lights revealed the silhouette of a patrol car in the darkness, and John knew at once that this was no ordinary stop. He slowed down, but his instincts told him there was trouble ahead. He knew that his and Kevin's life in this town had always been on the line, and now, under this searing light, the fear was real. the officers in the patrol car, was clearly preparing to demonstrate his authority. John could feel it in all his movements, even if they were barely noticeable. When the cars were finally almost touching, the officers suddenly turned on his blinkers, and they filled the space around him incredibly bright, deafening, like the eyes of a predator ready to attack. At that moment, everything in John's car seemed like a nightmare with no end in sight. "Did you see that?" Kevin asked, his voice sounding almost unnaturally quiet. He knew something terrible was about to happen, even if John tried not to show it. "Hold on," John replied, gripping the steering wheel harder than usual. He knew that his every move was now under close scrutiny, and that no wrong gesture would be without consequence. His breathing hitched and his hands became sticky with sweat. He glanced in the mirror and noticed the headlights of the patrol car reflected in his eyes, making them seem too big. Through the blinding light, John felt all the heat drain from his body again. The air seemed to be habitually cold, but now his every movement, his every word, everything was full of a sense of helplessness. He knew that for someone like him, these stops could be fatal. In their city, even the simplest of detentions often turned into a nightmare. The police in these neighborhoods were different, and John was used to the looks of contempt. There had been several such stops in his life, and all of them had left painful memories, but today it seemed especially ominous. The officers finally began to approach their car, his footsteps sounding heavy, and with each step John could feel the pressure building. There was no more certainty, no more goodnight. All that was left was waiting, the anticipation that this moment would turn out to be their true test. John noticed Kevin nervously shifting his gaze from the window to the dashboard, his lips pressed together as if he were prepared for the worst. The officers approached slowly, as if deciding exactly how and with what violence to begin this moment. John realized he was already trapped, and this tyranny of the road was just beginning. The moment the patrol car finally stopped, and its lights continued to blind them, John and Kevin felt the air around them tighten, as if the city itself, with its dirty streets and dangerous corners, had collapsed, engulfing them at that moment. The flames of the flashers and the bright lights of the headlights slowed their breathing, and all sounds became muffled, as if fog and silence filled the space between them and the police car. John looked in the mirror and immediately realized that the officers wasn't going to slow down any longer. He felt his heart begin to beat faster. It was like a portent of trouble. His fingers slid over the steering wheel, nervously gripping the shabby upholstery, trying to find the strength to stay calm. He knew it all depended on how he behaved, but right now he didn't even know if he could control the situation. Everything seemed too fragile, too dangerous. Then the patrol car door opened with a deafening creak. The officer's steps on the asphalt were sure, firm, as if he moved with the realization that this moment was his alone. He walked with such a seemingly complete sense of authority that every step he took literally sounded like a threat. The long, black leather belt with handcuffs and pistol was matched by his confidence, and his uniform was not just fabric, but a weapon he used to overwhelm. The officer's face mask, his tight uniform, and boots scraping hard against the asphalt created an atmosphere where there was no room for weakness. As the officers approached, John could already feel the cold sweat beating on his neck. He knew this wasn't just a police stop. It was something more, something inevitable, something that was building in the air like the storm before the thunder. The officer stopped right in front of the car, his eyes meeting John's through the glass. There was a cold, ruthless certainty in his gaze. He saw in front of him not a man, but an object, maybe even a threat. And that was the worst part, that to him, John wasn't a person, but simply part of a problem that needed to be solved. His gaze was cold, filled with cruelty and prejudice. It was a gaze that didn't try to understand or evaluate. It was a look that simply decided guilty. Guilty because he was black. Guilty because this world could decide his fate without giving him a chance for vindication. The officer stepped forward and for a few seconds just stood there, not moving, squinting at the driver. He wasn't in a hurry. He was enjoying this moment when the whole situation was in his hands. Each second dragged on, and John felt his body tense up, as if it were ready to shrink into a lump and disappear. But he remained seated, as if his roots were embedded in the ground. Kevin was silent, his eyes running over the officers, assessing his every move. Then, finally, the officers took a step forward, his shadow covering the car, and he tapped forcefully on the window. "Get out of the car!" His voice was hard, clear, with a note of authority, as if it were not a request, but an order. At that moment, John felt his hands clench. This wasn't just a demand, it was a compulsion, and he knew that, for all that he was right, not a single word he said would change the situation. He was just a piece in this game, and the game had already been decided. Without waiting for John to open the window, the officers turned abruptly and took a step toward the back door. He was ready to act, and his actions were always quick, sharp. There was not even a hint of doubt in his eyes. He had a target in front of him that needed to be controlled and subdued. Kevin noticed his hands shaking and hurried to get them under control, trying to find the strength for the decision that had to be made. But did the officers realize that he had no right to decide for them? Did he not know that behind every decision was a man with history and dignity? Why us? Kevin asked, but his words weren't aimed at an answer. They were just thrown into the void, like an attempt to make sense of the mess. The officers kept moving, and every step he took toward their car filled the air with a sense of imminent danger. As the officers approached the driver's side of the car, his every step seemed to resound in the void, echoing in the souls of those inside. Everything around him was permeated with an atmosphere of menace, and even the sound of his heavy footsteps, leaving traces on the asphalt, seemed to be a harbinger of trouble. John couldn't keep his hands still anymore. He gripped the steering wheel painfully, trying to keep his body from shaking. His eyes searched for any glance, any chance of understanding, but he found nothing but alienation in the officer's eyes. The officer stopped right in front of the car and took his time looking it over. He took his time, as if enjoying the process, as if he were the court deciding the fate of his defendant. Then his gaze slid to John. It was a quick glance, as if he knew who he was looking at, as if he had made up his mind about the man behind the wheel. There was not the slightest hint of interest or curiosity in his eyes. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to understand, didn't want to listen. It was a look that immediately put John in the guilty category. The officers looked out the window, and his eyes stopped on John's face. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. John felt his heart beating faster, his face covered with sweat. He saw the officer's gaze, fixed on him, a gaze full of disgust, mockery, and contempt. It was the look of a man who had already decided that the man before him was not a man, but something to be subdued, brought to the surface, and destroyed. "Don't you know how to behave?" The officers spoke with that irritation, as if he were not only watching him, but trying to destroy him with his tone alone. The roughness of his voice permeated the air, filling the space around him with a tension that seemed about to shatter all of John's attempts to remain calm. John didn't move, his breathing getting heavier and heavier. He tried to gather his thoughts, but every word the officer said felt like a blow, like a slap. Fury, even undisguised hatred, slid in his eyes. His every move, every look, was calculated to humiliate him, to break him, to make him feel guilty, even if he hadn't done anything wrong. Kevin, sitting next to him, felt his own hands clench into fists. He knew John didn't deserve to be treated this way, but it was also familiar, so true and dangerous, as if this wasn't just a clash between the people, but a battle of systemic prejudices that only grew stronger with each passing year. The officers continued to look at John, but his gaze was even more hostile now. He was clearly judging him as something inferior, something not worthy of respect. Those eyes, full of contempt, made John feel like nothing, a faceless object to be manipulated and humiliated. "Can you hear me, black man?" The officers finally asked the question, but his voice was imbued with such obvious contempt that not even a shadow of disrespect could hide his intent. "Get out of the car!" Every word was harsh, with a venom that only added to the atmosphere of violence. In the officer's eyes, John was not a person, but part of a problem that needed to be fixed. John felt his body tense up, and for a moment, he had the feeling that all he could do was simply not move, not give in to this pressure. But something was boiling inside him. He could feel his courage beginning to melt under that look, under those words, but he couldn't let himself give in. He knew that every step he took now was a fight for the right to be human. "Get out of the car!" This order sounded as if the officers were not just a policeman, but some kind of absolute ruler who needed no explanations or authorizations. His voice was low and hard, with a distinct aggression, as if he had long ago decided that John was guilty of something he hadn't even done. It wasn't just a demand, it was an order, and there was no room for objection. John had barely had time to realize what was happening before the officers. Without giving him time to react, opened the car door sharply and pulled him out. He didn't just open the door, he yanked it open with such force that it hit the body, leaving scratches. At that moment, John felt his heart pounding in his chest and his breath catching in fear. "Hey, what are you doing?" Kevin jumped up, trying to say something, but his words were lost in the rumble that already filled the street. The officers, ignoring his protests, tore at John's arm and pulled him forcefully out of the car. His fingers tightened around John's wrist like an iron vise, preventing him from moving. His elbow ached from the brutality with which he'd been pulled. Before John realized exactly what was happening, his body was already in the street. He was barely on his feet when the officers grabbed him by the arm and dragged him toward the back of the patrol car. His movements were abrupt, rough, without the slightest hint of respect. There was no doubt or curiosity in his eyes, only rage, as if the very fact that John was there was an insult to him. The officer's fingers left painful imprints on John's skin, and his face twisted in an expression of anger. He wasn't just grabbing the man, it was showing who was in charge, who decided whose life was worth something and whose wasn't. The blood rushed through John's veins, and every gust of wind, every movement seemed foreign, alien. His arms dangled helplessly along his body, and he could feel how hard it was for him to stand. "Don't you get it?" The officers bellowed again, his face ominous in the dim light of the street lamps. He was unleashing his anger on John, who had no time to realize what had happened, or why he was being dragged so roughly out of the car. The policeman's gaze was full of contempt. He looked at John as an animal, an object to be punished, not as a human being, with his rights and dignity. With every word, with every movement of the officers, John felt his inner calm slipping away. He knew that at this point any protest, any objection, could end badly, but the anger inside him began to build, anger that he had been deprived of the right to his own defense, that he was simply being dragged out of the car like a criminal, despite the absence of a crime. "What did I tell you?" The officers shoved him hard, and John almost lost his balance, but he clenched his teeth and held on. Kevin, sitting in the car, tried desperately to do something, but his movements were restrained. He knew it was dangerous to intervene too abruptly, and that these police officers would not be easy to deal with. He felt pain clench in his chest for his friend, who now stood before him, humiliated and deprived of his freedom, for no reason. John wanted to shout that this was unfair, that he didn't deserve to be treated this way, but something inside him said to be quiet. Be quiet and listen. He realized that any words were powerless here, and then, as he was roughly led towards the car, he felt something inside his soul breaking, but at the same time, he felt a powerful inner protest. He could not and must not let this happen without consequences. The officers pushed him toward the police car, and with each step everything around him became more and more real. When the officers grabbed John's wrists, his fingers clenched like iron pincers, almost to the point of pain. The officer's gaze was focused on one thing, on handcuffing him quickly, with maximum brutality, and completing the process, without giving him even the slightest chance to resist. John felt his joints cracking, and every spurt of pain went through his body as the officers mercilessly twisted his arms behind his back. "No movement, black man," the officers hissed, almost losing patience. His voice was full of rage and contempt. He didn't even try to be careful, didn't care about not hurting. It was all about punishment, humiliation, total control. With every sudden movement, with every thrust, John felt his body lose its freedom. His hands literally burned with pain as the officers pulled them behind his back with force and brutality, while with his other hand he was already pulling on the handcuffs. There was no regret in the officer's eyes. He acted as if it was his goal to break this man, to take away his human dignity. John tried to resist, but it was useless. He felt his joints twisted into painful angles, his body increasingly unable to control itself. The officers acted with methodical certainty, as if he knew that each of his thrusts would destroy something important in John, something that would be irreparably lost. "You're not a human being now. You're a criminal. Understand?" The officers continued, his face contorted with anger. He tore at John's hands even harder, as if that was his power, his way of showing who was in charge. John felt his chest tighten, his breathing getting heavy, but he still tried to pull himself together. He didn't want to show weakness, didn't want to be humiliated, even if he couldn't change anything. He couldn't let this continue, but every movement he made was becoming more and more helpless. The handcuffs finally tightened around his wrists, and John felt them digging painfully into his skin. He bit his lip to keep from screaming in pain, but there was the same fire in his eyes that was in the officer's. It was a clash of two worlds: the officer's world, where he had all the power, and John's world, where his only remaining resource was his resilience, his humanity. But it wasn't about strength. It was about being humiliated, about how on the road, in the shadow of those lights, John found himself not a man but an object to be punished. He was just part of a scheme to the officers, a part to be subdued, made weak, made to understand his place. When the handcuffs finally buckled, the officers shoved John forward sharply, causing him to almost fall to the pavement. He didn't give him a second to regain his balance, or a chance for pride. Everything was calculated, every move, every look to break, to humiliate, to tear this world apart. John felt his knees barely bearing the strain. He was trying to preserve himself, his dignity, but now it was already difficult. He was like a malleable body that was just being dragged toward the police car, without considering his pain or his inner resistance. And every step he took toward the car was a step to become even more helpless, even more humiliated. The officers was completely absorbed in his task, and he didn't see fit to show the slightest respect for John. He continued to lead him on, looking mockingly at his vulnerability. All he saw in John was a helpless criminal, stripped of his right to his pride. "You keep quiet if you don't want it to get worse," the officer said. Looking at John again, he spoke with such contempt that the words seemed to lose their meaning. The officers continued to lead John to the car, oblivious to his pain, to his silent resistance. He was in his element, enjoying the power he had in his hands. Every step John took, every hesitant attempt to stand up to the officers, it was not just a moment of punishment, but an act of demonstrating his superiority. His confidence was so evident that he began to speak to John without hiding his contempt. "Damn freak," the officer said with a sneer, giving the word all his hatred and contempt. His voice sounded like a hammer blow, like a punishment that had no meaning except to intimidate and humiliate. "You think you're important. You don't belong here." Every word that flew from his lips was like an insult, like a weapon aimed straight at John's heart. He could hear the officers scoffing, but there wasn't a shadow of regret on his face. His eyes burned with hatred, as if the mere fact that John was black was reason enough for him to act like a tyrant. "You black man, you think you can come out here and live in peace?" the officers continued, not slowing his pace. "You don't deserve nothing, nothing." The officer's anger was growing, and every word he spoke became more foul and humiliating. He did not hide his hatred, did not hide his contempt. John was nothing to him, just an object on which to practice his anger, to prove his superiority. "All you've ever known is how to humiliate people, how to survive among people like you," he continued, as if savoring every word. "You don't know what respect is, because no one ever taught you. You're always just waiting to get back behind the wheel, as resentful and hateful as ever." John felt his body clench at those words, as each insult penetrated his soul. He tried to hold on, not to give in to this rage, not to let himself fall, but the officer's words were heavy, like stones falling on his chest. The officers continued to sneer. Each time his tongue defiled another word, he spoke of John as a lesser being, as a human being with no dignity or right to respect. And there was such confidence in his voice that John felt his own confidence crumbling as he grew more and more vulnerable under this flood of hatred. "You're not worth my time, but I'll still make sure you realize who's in charge," the officer said, as if proud of his dominance. His face was cruel, and his lips curved into a vicious grin as he finished another round of insults. Every word the officers uttered was not just a humiliation, it was a way of showing who was in control, who could easily dispose of another person's life. To the officers, John was just an object whose life could be played as a toy, ruthlessly breaking his dignity. John felt the rage seeping into him, every word becoming a blow he couldn't dodge. He clenched his teeth, trying to keep the tears at bay, but deep down his pride was shattered. He wasn't ready for this, but perhaps it never had been. It was too painful, too humiliating, and worst of all, it was with impunity. John tried to pull himself together. He tried to fight what was happening, but his body was already broken. Every movement was agonizing, as if his wrists were burning from the pain of the handcuffs. The feeling of their steel prongs digging into his skin was becoming more and more unbearable. He tried to move, tried to change his position even slightly, but each time his hands were clenched so tightly that they seemed to refuse to work. It was as if an invisible force was holding him in place. and every attempt to free himself from this iron fetter only made the pain worse. "Are you trying to break free?" the officers asked mockingly, watching John with a defeated expression. He didn't even see John as a human being. In his eyes, he was just an object on which he was wielding his power. The officers did not take his eyes off his suffering. He realized that the more painful it was, the more pleasure he would get. John tried to hold back his scream, but he could feel his body being squeezed in unbearable positions, his strength waning and the pain of the handcuffs becoming physically unbearable. He could barely stand, his legs buckling, but he held on. He couldn't let himself fall, couldn't give the officers the satisfaction of being broken. Everything around him was becoming cloudy and distorted with pain. John's gaze grew more and more dull. He realized that every moment, every second he spent in this state was bringing him closer to his limit. He wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come out of his mouth. He was like an animal caught in a trap, and his own body had become the enemy. The handcuffs gripped his wrists so tightly that it felt like they were about to tear the skin. Even the simplest of movements brought terrible pain. The officers, however, continued to stare at him without showing the slightest sympathy. He came closer, and each step he took was like a new humiliation. John was unable to resist. His spirit was almost broken. He could not find the strength for even the slightest resistance. He was no longer a human being. He had become an object to be treated, to be humiliated and tortured. "See how weak you are," said the officers with a wry smile as he watched him suffer. "You can't even stand properly. Fucking soulless. You're nothing." Those words cut into John's mind like a knife. He knew he couldn't fight it. He could no longer fight this officers, who was infinitely strong in his cruelty. His strength was leaving him, and he could barely stay on his feet. Weakness coursed through his whole body. His legs became cotton, and he felt his body losing more and more control with each passing moment. He was not prepared for such cruelty, such humiliation. His inner world was crumbling, and all that remained was a blind acceptance of his helplessness. He couldn't defend his honor. He couldn't regain his dignity. Every moment, every step toward the police car, every glance from the officers robbed him of the last shred of his self-confidence. His inner protest, his desire to resist, was slowly dying. John became just a body to be taken away, ruthlessly and without question. The officers stood in front of John, not hiding his sneer. He saw in this moment not just his power, but the real pleasure of being able to humiliate so cruelly. There was not the slightest sympathy in his eyes, only arrogance and contempt. He felt unpunished, like a man who could do anything to others because he had the right. He was sure of his impunity. "Do you know who you are, you goddamn Negro?" the officers asked, his voice full of bitterness and anger, but at the same time pleasure. He didn't use the usual word nigger. No, it was much worse for him. He chose a word that wasn't just an insult, but a statement of superiority, a way to put John in his place. He did it with a facial expression, as if those words were his weapon and John was the target. John felt his chest tighten into a tight noose, and his heart drummed, unable to accept the brutality that was being directed at him. Every word of the officers was tearing at his soul, and he could do nothing about it. He was deprived of even the opportunity to reply, and his every silence only increased the humiliation. "You, Negro, are worthless. You could just be brought to your knees and you'd be thankful you were still alive," the officers continued, looking at John with a smirk, savoring his moment of power. He knew that he could inflict more pain with words than physical violence, that those words would enter John's soul and stay there forever. The thunderstorm of pain that came from the handcuffs became secondary. The officer's words penetrated John even harder. Like endless blows, he felt his dignity being torn apart, every cell in his body clenching with shame. He wanted to scream, wanted to shout at him, to tell him he was wrong, that he was human, but he couldn't. He was like a toy that had no right to his voice, to his opinion. The officers, however, continued. His laughter was bitter, venomous. He took pleasure in John's humiliation, in the fact that he was helpless. The officers knew that if he pushed the man any further, he would break him, and John could already feel his spirit breaking, his inner world crumbling. There was no more strength to resist. "I look at you and think that you Negro will still be like this for the rest of your life. You'll always be at the bottom because you were made that way. That's what you are," the officer said contemptuously, savoring every moment, every word, every jab he took at John's soul. John tried to keep his emotions in check, but deep down his world was shaking. He was no longer a confident man. Every word that insulted him struck, and all he could do was stand there, endure and feel destroyed. The words he was being humiliated with were penetrating deeper and deeper into his mind. His whole personality, everything he knew about himself, began to fade away. The officers didn't stop. He continued to build his power, confident that he had John in his grasp. Those words, that brutality, it was his weapon, and he used it to the end, not even giving John a chance to recover. It wasn't just punishment, it was destruction that started at the most basic of all human dignity. The officers continued to taunt John, his words becoming more and more insulting and harsh. He enjoyed every moment, like an animal that consumes its prey, not realizing that his confidence might soon be shattered. The officers were sure that if he continued to humiliate John, he would break down and no longer be a threat. He didn't think there was anything that could change the course of the situation. But then, suddenly, the officer's gaze slid down toward John's pocket. He noticed a small encased document that turned out to be in a card. It was John's friend, a man the officers had in no way expected to see here. He was a man the officers was familiar with. His gaze frowned for a second. John noticed the expression change in the officer's face. His confidence, with which he had been so fiercely humiliating the man, shook slightly. His eyes became thoughtful for a split second, and his gestures became less abrupt. It was as if he paused for a moment, as if something in the situation had shifted. The officers, oblivious to his own behavior, took the card and opened it. His hand trembled slightly when he saw the name. The moment was so unpredictable that he didn't immediately realize what was happening. It was a friend of John's, a man who had been in contact with him in the past. The officers knew him, though perhaps not intimately enough to realize the whole picture. But it was enough to give him pause, as if he suddenly realized that his actions, heretofore so confident and unpunished, could have consequences. The officer's face changed. The cruel look that had been one of fury and contempt was now much more wary. He frowned for a moment, realizing that the man before him was not just an ordinary man, but someone whose name could mean much more than he had thought. Something about this moment made him rethink everything that had happened so far. A second of silence hung in the air. The officers began to analyze the situation, his face darkening and his thoughts confused. He could continue his humiliation, continue to use force, but now he was faced with a choice. He thought about how this could affect his career, his reputation, how it might affect his actions in the future. John didn't know what was going on. He tried to understand why the officers frowned for a second. What could have happened to stop him? But he couldn't concentrate on that, for his thoughts were consumed with pain, humiliation, and fear. The officers nervously clutched the card in his hand, slowly realizing that this might not be a mere coincidence, but something much more important. He looked around, unsure of what to do. The tension in the air began to build. That moment when everything could have changed hovered between them like a blast wave, ready to break the silence. From that moment on, nothing could ever be the same for either of them. The officer stood holding his card, and his thoughts began to whirl at an alarming rate. The name he had just read sliced through his mind like a lightning strike. He didn't immediately realize what had happened. All of his confidence, everything he had been filled with up until that moment, seemed to vanish. He felt a wave of anxiety come over him, causing him to freeze inwardly. No, it can't be, the officers thought. Once again looking over that card, he tried not to believe what he had just read, but the name on the card continued in front of his eyes, as if it had been written in blood. It was a friend of John's, an influential man. His name was known in the circles in which the officers had once worked. His name was suddenly synonymous with respect and authority. This was not just any black man. This was someone the officers may have crossed paths with at business meetings, or heard from colleagues who respected him for his connections and accomplishments. The officers knew that this man was not someone to demean or put down, especially when such serious names come into play. The officer's fingers clenched on that, as if he were trying to escape from his own realization. A whirlwind of thoughts swirled in his head. Everything he'd thought about this detainee, everything he'd done so far, had turned into a mistake. With each passing moment, the officers realized more and more clearly that the situation had become far more dangerous than he had anticipated. His heart clenched. He began to realize that he had done something that could not be without consequences. he could still taste his arrogance, his power, but now it had become a burden. Everything that had been associated with racism, with humiliation, now came upon him with renewed force. He realized that this man could not be treated like this, that this act could cost him not only his position, but everything he had built his entire career around. Suddenly, this wasn't just a simple detention, this was an action that could ruin his life. The officers tried to suppress a growing sense of unease, but he couldn't. He looked at John again, but now it was different. The man he had so cruelly humiliated was at the center of this game far more than he could have imagined. The officers saw not only pain in his gaze, but also a hidden confidence, as if he knew that this was how it was going to end, with the officers realizing his own mistake. He slowly pulled his gaze away from the card and began to ponder what to do now. A few seconds ago, he had been sure that he was right, but now it was clear to him that he had gone too far. All his actions, all his words, they could not be taken back. It was a moment of realization that his actions were not just wrong, they were catastrophic. He had ruined everything that could have been a simple detention, just another procedure. And now that he realized who was in front of him, a feeling of remorse swept over him. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He didn't know how to justify himself. Everything he'd done seemed untrue, a lie, and now he stood before a man who had power, a power he himself had ignored, destroying his career and reputation along the way. There was a storm going on inside the officers. He tried to find a way out of this situation, but realized that there was no easy way to justify himself. Every move he made now could be seen as an attempt to hide, to avoid responsibility for what he had done. John knew it all, and the officers felt the truth haunting him in every look, in every word he could have uttered but never dared. The officer stood there, unable to move, and his gaze, now almost blank, flickered over John's face, then back to the hit card in his hand. He felt his confidence, built on downsides of identical operations, on pressure and domination, crumbling like an old building. It was empty inside him, but it was still churning, with fear, with the realization that he had made a catastrophic mistake. The confusion was so intense that the officers didn't even realize that his hand had begun to tremble. He tried to maintain a semblance of calm, but his face, once stony and confident, was now a reflection of the utter chaos in his head. He didn't know what to do. The internal conflict was literally burning him from the inside out. How could I not understand? The question resounded in his mind. That question swirled around in his mind like a splinter, mercilessly tormenting his mind. How could he have let things go this far? He was an experienced officer, always knowing how to handle things, always confident in what he was doing. But now, at this moment, all his confidence was vanishing. The officers realized that the actions he had taken had led to consequences he could not even imagine. The shadows in his mind were thickening. He didn't just see John, he saw his friend, a man he could relate to on a whole other level. He saw his face, now connected to this terrible incident. His own face was distorted, reflecting what was going on inside his head. He wanted to justify himself, wished he could say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Embarrassment, shame, and fear of what had already been done were creeping deep into his soul. A fierce internal conflict was erupting within him. The officers, who had always considered himself infallible, was now trapped by his own actions. He didn't know how to rectify the situation. How should he stand in front of this man, knowing that he had just blown his entire career? How could he face the people who trusted him when all he had done was destruction, violence, and racism? How can I be who I was? That question ran through his mind over and over again. Doubt about his own beliefs and what he had always considered to be the norm kept him on his toes. He didn't know how to proceed. His every move was now burdened by the heavy realization that he had just become a part of history that no one could erase. John stood, silent, with a defiant look, watching the officers. He didn't say a word. His silence was heavy, but it only added to the internal struggle the officers was experiencing. Every silence from John became like an accusation to him, like a reminder that this man knew far more than he did. The officers felt everything he knew disintegrate. Everything he had once called a confident stance had become false to him. John's gaze was calm, but there was some hidden reproach in it that was even more murderous than any words. The officers knew that if he continued on his way, it would mean the end not only of his career, but also of his honor. That moment was the turning point that he could not forget. His confidence was gone, and For perhaps the first time in years, he stood before a man who had nothing to prove. Friends, we really want to know what you think about this story. Write in the comments, have you ever experienced racism or unfair treatment in your life? How have you dealt with such situations? It's important for us to hear your thoughts, because each of your stories brings us closer to each other. We appreciate each and every one of you. Your comments, likes and subscriptions help us grow and create even more interesting and important content. Your support is incredibly important to us, and we want you to know that you are part of our team. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now. Click on the like and the bell so you don't miss our new stories. Your attention is our main motivator. We wish you a wonderful day, goodness and strength. Thank you for being with us.